This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. In GMP-regulated environments, maintaining proper records and documentation is critical to data integrity, regulatory compliance, and of course, GMP best practices. Starting with Part 11, more than 2 decades ago, we've seen an emphasis on good record keeping and a shift to paperless. Still, paper-based systems are prevalent around the world, but given our current environment and reliance on digital technologies, are we now at a point where the industry is ready to embrace that shift? Here to talk about the ins and outs of paper versus electronic records is industry expert Chris Wubbolt. Great to have you back, Chris. Welcome again.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I'm always happy to provide a podcast, so thank you very much.
Of course. We'll dive right in on this, Chris. As compliance standards continue to tighten up, life science companies across the board are left with hundreds of questions about what to record, how to record it. So to get started here, can you give us a snapshot of the current environment and what you're seeing in industry today?
Yeah, of course. So again, I think most companies have definitely delved into the electronic record keeping environment, and there are very few that have not gone at least partially electronic. So we're and it's been like that for not just recently, but for years. The issue is sometimes the controls associated with electronic records haven't been appropriately established when companies have gone electronic. But for the environment today is that regulatory agencies really expect companies to utilize, if there's an ability to collect electronic data and records as opposed to printing something out, they expect that to be done and the appropriate controls to be established, because there are a lot of things that can happen with paper records that may impact compliance possibly. Same with electronic records, but you can apply more controls to electronic records. And ultimately, everyone does use electronic records if they, to some degree, if they recognize that or not. I know there was a FDA guidance back in 2003, scope and application of Part 11, where there's some discussion about using maybe the typewriter rule for paper records as opposed to electronic, but that's really rarely used now, and not appropriately used for sure in many cases. So the expectation really is using electronic systems and data to support compliance.
And that, of course, makes the most sense given where we are currently. So what are some of the concerns when electronic systems such as filter integrity test units, Carl Fisher moisture analyzers, or other similar systems which are capable of generating electronic records when those systems are only being used to create paper printouts?
Yeah, that's really the crux of it, because when a lot of these systems have the capability to collect electronic data, but companies are not using these systems in that manner. And I've actually, for a Carl Fisher or a filter integrity test unit that I did an assessment of recently, and one of the companies that I work with, they actually had I think 1,231 filter integrity test results that were stored on the filter integrity test unit, and I think that was only about 15% of the capacity of the system. Now they used it. What they used was they printed paper records. So the printouts, if you're familiar with those filter integrity use test units, there's a printout that comes associated with that. And but they were not relying on the electronic data, the electronic records that are being stored. They weren't even looking at that. It wasn't connected through a communication port like an RS-232 port or Ethernet connection to a network, and basically those records were just on those systems. And the claim was that all the data that you need is on the paper record. So on that printout, and that may be valid in some degrees, but in some cases, but it's really hard to establish that. So ultimately, you have to look at the predicate rule requirement, which states that the original record is used for GMP purposes, not just GMP but GXP purposes. And when the original record is the electronic record, because as I mentioned, you can save the state and then print it out later if the printer runs out of paper or ink or whatever. So when you're using these types of systems, you have to look at the original record. Then there's the concept of a true copy of the original record. So is a paper, and you have to be able to answer the question, is a paper record a printout from a filter integrity test unit or Carl Fisher, for example, are they true copies of the electronic record? And so the electronic record has all the information typically that's on the paper record and vice versa. So can you justify that a paper record printout from a filter integrity test unit is a true copy of the electronic record, the original record? And I think in some cases you can do that. However, there is information in the electronic system that you can't ignore. So, for example, the example that I mentioned related to the filter integrity test unit, they're actually, when I reviewed those 1,231 tests on the filter integrity test unit, the electronic data that was not even being looked at or being transferred, I actually found several filter integrity test unit failures. And that, there's a failure and you don't print that failure out, then you don't have a paper record of that failure. And if you don't have all the data, that's a data integrity issue, right? So when I looked at the failures, I asked about that, and the company that I was doing an assessment of the data integrity assessment for, they went back to their nonconformances and deviations and kappas. And for some of the failures, we did identify an NCR that may have been generated, for example, but there were several failures that there's no documentation for. There's no nonconformance. It was data, failed data that was not being used. And that was because no one was looking at the electronic system. And again, no one was looking at the electronic data. And so you could maybe justify that a paper record from a filter integrity test unit is a true copy, but you still need to look at those electronic systems because of things. And that's really a system audit trail. I would call that a system log. And that shows you that there might be other data that was not printed out. And again, that's definitely a data integrity issue. And there's no difference between that from a very simple system like that or a Carl Fisher, or even a balance or a pH meter that retains electronic data that can be transferred, but many times isn't, to not reporting laboratory results from a chromatography system because it failed, for example. So that's one of the biggest concerns that I've seen when using electronic systems and relying on the paper printout. The paper printout may be substantially, possibly a true copy of the electronic, but you still need to look at the electronic system because of those issues such as failures or runs that are not reported because the paper printouts aren't being, the printouts are not being printed for that data.
What would be the purpose of having an electronic system, having records in that system, but then printing them out and relying on the paper copy? Why? I mean, I'm just trying to understand why they would even be doing that. Is there a benefit to having the paper? I mean, I'm just trying to think it through.
Yeah, no, well, it's probably easier to have a printout attached to a batch record and go along like that, not worry about the electronic. But it's not, it might be easier, but it doesn't minimize that data integrity risk of failed results or unreported results that you can identify by reviewing the electronic system. So there's and it's really because people have always done it that way. And that's not a good reason to keep a practice because
Right.
just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean it's the right way to do it today.
Correct. No, that, and we see that time and time again. So absolutely. And you mentioned at the beginning that most organizations have at least partially transitioned to some form of electronic records keeping. And we know that the World Health Organization guidance on good records and data management practices discourages hybrid systems or systems that are using, some paper and some electronic, and recommends replacement at the earliest opportunity. So is there a target date that you know of for discontinuation of paper documentation, or is this going to be something that we just continue to see for a long time to come?
Well, the MHRA guidance has a similar date. I think they actually have specific dates in the MHRA guidance on data integrity, or at least one of the versions of that guidance did. But I don't know really of any date. I know I've done some assessments, some very large companies where they're still using old devices and instruments that make it difficult to fully rely on, to have appropriate controls for data integrity when you're relying on these older instruments that don't really have the capability to meet data integrity requirements or standards. And there's a lot of controls and manual processes that you have to implement in order to get some semblance of data integrity for these. And again, these large companies, this is definitely not small pharma, not medium sized, but large pharma. And the rationale is for this company, when this is brought up, is that they have X number of these units. And I think it was about a Carl Fisher that I was referring to, that I was assessing at that point. And I think they cost $40,000 or so each or something like that. Being a compliance person, I don't know what the details of the costs are. I probably should know more of that than I do, but I don't have to buy these systems. So that's there's a cost factor, and so
Right.
not everything can be replaced at once. So I think that as long as these hybrid systems are out there, and on the clinical side, when you look at clinical laboratories, with that a lot of the systems that are used in those environments are they've been developed for patient care and so forth, and they're not intended to be used in a FDA Part 11 compliant manner, for example. So there's also issues with those systems, and sometimes those are much more expensive than a Carl Fisher moisture analyzer. So I think a lot of it is cost and time. You can't do everything at once, but as long as this is the situation, then we're going to have potential issues with data integrity for these types of systems.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. I think the upfront investments in digital technologies can be large. I mean, sometimes, cost prohibitive maybe for smaller to mid-size pharmaceutical companies, definitely a disadvantage to them in that regard. But can you maybe highlight the costs associated with not making that transition? Because I mean, I think at the end of the day, we need to weigh the pros and cons here and really figure out when the scales tip.
Yeah, well, I think the ultimate cost is that you have a compliance issue that causes for a field alert or 43 or a warning letter, and remediation, and in some cases there are consent decree circumstances, and the old sharing plow back in the 90s, I think it was, or 2000s, I suppose. I think their consent decree for remediation was, I think they were fined $500 billion or something like that. And I think it cost even more. That may not be right. $500 million. Sorry, it may have cost even more than it did cost more for the remediation of fixing all the problems. So they're fined that amount. And then also there are companies that, because of data integrity issues, some associated with the use of these types of not using the appropriate systems or implementing the appropriate systems, they had their products that were, their submissions that were delayed. They received a complete response letter from the FDA, and they needed to address these issues. before they could get approval of their drugs, and that can make or break a company. And we actually, my company that I work with, we actually work with a lot of companies that have received CRLs, complete response letters, that have had issues that have caused that letter to be received, which have to be remediated. Normally, I think that they require those issues to be responded to or addressed within 1 year, and then they have to go back and then resubmit if you exceed that 1 year time period. So that could be the cost, not getting a product approved, all the remediation work that you have to do, which is much more expensive than a $40,000 coral Fisher moisture analyzer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cost of remediation or the downtime, right? If your facility gets shut down and you can no longer make your product for a period of time, I mean, that's a large nut to crack too. So what are some of the key benefits? Chris, talk about automation or digitization. Like, what are some of the benefits that a company gets that make it would help, hopefully sway their decision to finally move to a electronic system?
Yeah, well, the benefits, of course, are improved efficiency and better compliance, more accurate data. So the benefits are pretty directly identifiable. And the issues are then, some people, again, they look at the cost or they think it's too complicated or too complex to automate necessarily. And they look at the costs and they look at the ROI. So if we have spend this much money on the system, hardware and software, and then also this much to implement and validate, how long does it take to return on that investment? Sometimes that's actually hard to quantitate, but there's probably reduction of the number of resources that may be needed. That doesn't mean to fire people or anything like that, but that means to reallocate those people to other areas, or maybe do that. And so there is an ROI. How long does it take how much does it cost to implement these systems, acquire and implement the systems, and then what is the ROI on the return on investment? And you have to be able to calculate that. And it might be 3 years or 5 years, and then you have to look at that also. Or it could be less than that in some cases. But sure. I think the benefits are definitely efficiency, improved compliance, and improved data accuracy, data integrity, actually.
Right. And so thinking about the differences between manual and electronic batch records, what controls need to be in place for paper that aren't necessary for electronic, or vice versa?
Yeah, well, if you look at paper batch records, you have master batch record, and that's maintained by quality, and then it's approved. And then when you issue a paper batch record, it has to be printed and assigned a unique batch number, which might be able to be done on the electronic. Ultimately, all the data is all the master batch records are maintained electronically in some cases. And so to some degree, and so you have to assign that unique number. Then you have to manually distribute that, and then all the data is recorded electronically or handwritten, and it has to be reviewed that way. How that data is transferred from one part of the manufacturing process to the next, and that's all collected, it's all reviewed. So that's all very time intensive and manual process. If it's all electronic, someone that works with me does batch record review. They get a copy of the electronic batch record, they review it, and they're not even on site at the facility. So there is a lot of efficiency in using the electronic batch records, and you can issue them from your automated system. And then do automated checks on those batch records also. So that's, there's sometimes controls or expectations that are required for the batch record. You can automate a lot of those checks too, so that you are reviewing discrepancies that may have been identified by the system as opposed to trying to identify them manually. So ultimately, It's much more time consuming process for manual systems, batch records, than for electronic.
It sounds obviously it's very time consuming to have someone managing the batch records manually versus electronically. But it also seems to me that then the risk, human error risk is much higher with a manual system as well. I mean, you're the expert, but it just seems like there's an opportunity there for mistakes to happen. So for those still using manual records management or paper-based management systems, what are some critical steps or items that they need to consider to reduce error and, of course, minimize their risk?
Yeah, I think it's a really good training of personnel. People that are reviewers that are detail oriented, that look at both the forest and the trees. Good procedures on, good documentation practice and adherence to those procedures. There's, it's really all manual, it's all training, it's all procedural that you have to follow. When you have automated systems, then of course you have back in the first FDA guidance on computer validation was called the Blue Book, and that actually stated, I think that came out in 1983, that actually stated something like that the FDA considers that automated systems are nothing more than procedures, SOPs that are automated. So computer systems are nothing more than SOPs that are automated. So again, you automate the manual process, and that everyone knows how quickly you can use a calculator to calculate, results of things, as opposed to manually doing the multiplication and the division and the other calculations. So that by itself saves so much time. And then when you have manual processes, you need those procedures, you need the training, you need the review, you need the time in order to use those manual systems. So
right. And time is money, I mean, it is for sure. So we're talking about the ROI and the upfront cost, but I mean, I guess it's spreading the cost out over time. Yeah. If you have all this labor intensive work going on, but I mean, it still costs and it needs to be factored in. So I just want to see if you can share your thoughts on where you think we're headed as an industry on this particular topic. And should we expect to see a shift to all electronic or digital systems on a large scale, anytime soon?
Well, I really think we are there already. There's some environments like clinical materials, and you have to follow GMPs to make clinical materials also, right? And it may not be as cost effective for clinical materials if the batches are smaller, and there's other considerations for some of these CDMOs, and so you may not see it everywhere, but again, those batches are sometimes much smaller, and not as much is going on with those processes. Although gene and cell therapy, that's definitely not the case. But I think we're already there for electronic systems, electronic records. We're already there, and it's just a matter of how are we getting everything? How are the rest of these systems and processes that should be electronic now, like the filter integrity test units? Why are they not being used with electronic records as opposed to the paper printouts? That's, I think, where the focus really should be for those systems that are capable of being electronic record keeping systems, but they're not being used in that manner.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll start to see a shift. I mean, it sounds like, are those things that are being identified by inspectors?
Oh yeah, for sure. They're definitely being looked at by regulatory agencies, and filter integrity test units for sure. That's a big focus by regulators, because everyone knows that there are risks associated with them. But there's new versions of software that's available, and it makes it, there's really no excuse not to have electronic records from those types of systems that are capable of generating electronic records.
Yeah. So it seems to me, though, as the regulators are going out there doing their thing, and or auditors like yourself going out and really helping companies do those internal audits, the more times these things are recognized and pointed out, and that they're going to get pinged for it, hopefully that will help sway their decision to make that total shift.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's not going away. That's for sure.
Excellent. Well, Chris, as always, thanks for sharing your insights on this topic. It was a great one to get caught up on. What last thoughts or ideas would you like to leave with our audience today?
Yeah, I guess, I would say, don't just look at the way you've always done things, but try to really, we're in a new environment, new expectations, and we need to stay with what the expectations are. If you don't keep moving ahead, you fall behind. So that's what I would say. Don't just look at things the way you've always done it.
Great point. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate your time today. It's been great having you here as our guest again and covering this important topic with you.
Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you. Also, I want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And lastly, a big thanks to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, you can message us via LinkedIn or through our website. If you enjoyed today's episode, head on over to your